This is TWiT.
You know what today is? Oh, I was going to pull this down off my shelf. Hold on a second. It might be with your microphone in the basement, but let me check.
You're never going to live that down, Lisa. I hope you know.
I know.
This is a recurring joke.
I know. I did this to myself.
This iPod turned 23 today.
Wow.
The vibes and the feels.
I bet you Abrar and Lisa don't even remember the first iPod.
I remember I couldn't afford it. I was like in probably sixth grade at the time, but I remember it was like what the rich kids had.
Oh yeah.
But I did get an iPod Shuffle a couple of years later, and that was my starter Apple device.
Oh yeah, the chewing
I also
gum.
could not afford one, but I had a Dell Pocket DJ instead.
Oh Lord, that's awful. I'm so sorry.
Leo, I bought an iRiver H140 because you could plug a microphone into the top, and thus began my podcasting career in
Wow.
04.
You were podcasting off the iRiver. Yeah,
That's
this
right,
was not my
100%.
first MP3 player. I had something called the Diamond Rio before this.
Yeah, that thing was awesome.
Yeah, and it played Audible books, which is the main reason I got it. I had spent years commuting 2 hours, sometimes 4 hours a day to CNET. I'm sorry. ZDTV, which kind of was CNET. Anyway, it's a long story. It's very incestuous. But anyway, and that commute almost killed me. So I was listening to books on tape, but they came in boxes of cassettes. And when Audible came along and said, oh, you know, you don't have to have a box of cassettes. You just need an MP3 player. I thought, oh, this is great. This was, remember, Steve Jobs, 1,000 songs in your pocket. And one of the things that made this possible was there was a little hard drive, a little tiny matchbook-sized hard drive inside this, which the manufacturers, I'm trying to remember, was it Canon? Who made that first hard drive? Couldn't figure out where the market was. In fact, that they were close to discontinuing it when Steve Jobs came along and said, we want to make a music player that can hold a gigabyte. And at the time, a gigabyte of flash RAM would have been obscenely expensive. So they found this hard drive and they put it in here, and it became the first really popular. I would say this was Apple's first consumer hit, right? Not the Apple II, not the Macintosh, not the iMac, this.
Because I think it was for everybody, right? It was like, as a child, you'd hear about it, right? Because all the cool kids had one, and it wasn't.
Yeah, all the sixth graders wanted one.
Exactly. It wasn't. Just
And it was like, yeah. In the era before, like, you know, cell phones being like, I mean, people had cell phones, of course, but like, I don't know, before the smartphone, I feel like the iPod was like the first like device that you had that you were like proud to show off. Like Abrar was saying, like it kind of made you look cool and everybody wanted one. I feel like it was like I consider it to be like the first like really like consumer tech gadget that kind of, you know, started the era that we're in today.
And bro, really for everyone is such a key phrase because Apple was this cool kind of smaller company, but Apple people were their own. It was its own culture, and it was kind of in its own universe. And the iPod really was for everyone. It made people on Windows want Mac devices or Apple devices.
Yeah. And this, of course, inspired the iPhone in some respects. Remember when Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone in 2007, he showed it with a phone dial on it first. And he said, we've invented an iPod phone. And then he said, no, just joking. And showed the remarkable iPhone in 2007. That was, of course, the biggest consumer hit for Apple. But this is
I thought you were going to say the rocker.
The rocker. Yeah, the Motorola rocker, which predated the iPhone.
It was the first introduction of iTunes on a mobile device.
Yeah. The iPod came out on this day, November 10th, 2001. Wow.
Oh, I totally got my dates wrong then. I was thinking about, I was not in sixth grade in 2001. I was in first grade. But that sixth grade was the first time I remember people having one. I think that's the difference.
This was ridiculous. This was not, this was I'll tell you, one of the reasons this was a niche product at first is because it only worked with a Mac.
Yeah.
Right.
See, it has a FireWire port on it.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So that was...
not for everyone.
Not for everyone. And it wasn't until his employees convinced Steve Jobs that to make iTunes for Windows that it really took off. So this was
and
a
it was
niche
really
product.
for everyone. Yeah.
Then it really was. Exactly.
Yeah.
This was just for the few, the hardy. It was, I think it was Toshiba actually that made the hard drive that made this possible. Anyway, happy birthday to the iPod. And this is a good time to think about your first iPod, to think back in time. I'm glad I kept this, actually. You know what's funny is every once in a while I plug in the FireWire cable and see what I was listening to in 2001, and then I immediately disconnect it and say, oh, never mind. Never mind. I think it was Britney Spears.
I love
Hit
that.
Me Baby One More Time was like,
As it should be.
yeah.
Yeah. that's the
Britney's
time.
still a thing. Yeah.
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 Timeless.
Yeah. It was a 1.8 inch drive made by Toshiba. Thank you, Keith. I think you're right. It was the first. If that didn't exist, this wouldn't have existed. So.
It's also the reason this is called a podcast.
Oh, you're right.
yeah.
Benito, our producer, is pointing out this gave the name to the shows that we do. Podcasting. I never always hated the name podcast because it implied an iPod, and in the early days, you did have to listen to this.
Yeah.
Because my first podcast was 2004, 3 years later, and it really was a podcast. It was the only you'd have to download it on your Mac, and then synchronize it using iTunes to your MP3 player, your iPod, so you can listen to it.
You could use others. I had the Juice podcast receiver. That was, I think, Adam's thing. Do you remember like the Podcast Alley and Podcast Pickle Days, and Adam Curry had the daily source code. Dave Weiner had morning coffee notes.
No, I don't remember any of that at all. No, no, of course I do. I was one of the first 10 podcasters in the world. There were many of us.
The listener you, not the Leo you.
Oh, I was around back then. I really was. Hey, thank you for watching this little snippet from our big show, the News Roundtable, This Week in Tech. I'm Leo Laporte. Each week we cover the week's tech news, in-depth analysis, but it's also fun and engaging. You'll find it at twit.tv along with all of our shows. And if you want more, just hit the subscribe button, and we'll be sure to bring you a lot more great content. Thanks for listening.